Wait, what are we doing to this bitch?
We're disassembling it now.
Oh, that one's hot. Be careful.
What's that?
That oil pan. That oil jelly.
It's hot?
Yeah.
Oh my hell.
Alright, the first thing you're going to do is remove all the bits and pieces off the block. There's going to be multiple brackets and such, just like little pieces here and there. And remove the two 11mm bolts holding on the oil filter adapter plate. And then there's going to be a little gasket underneath that plate that you're going to need to remove, and it's definitely going to need to be replaced. Then take your 2 or 3 jaw puller and use that to remove the crank sprocket on the front of the crankshaft. You're gonna need to remove the woodruff key from the crank to get this off a little bit easier. I just use a chisel and a hammer, and if you just hit it on one end of it, it kind of starts to rotate out, and then you can grab the other side of the woodruff key and just rotate it out of the slot that it's in. Next, you're gonna remove the rear main seal from the back of the crankshaft. There's just 4 bolts holding it on that go around the bottom of the crank. Now you'll want to remove the water pump drive gear from the front of the engine. There's just 2 torque screws holding it on. After removing those, you just gently tap on the back of it with a hammer, and I just use an extension to kind of punch it out with, but you need to use something flat so it won't damage that piece. It's basically just a bearing that's pressed into the hole, so just giving it a couple of taps, it should just release pretty easily. So now that all you have left is the pistons, rods, and crankshaft, I'm going to show you how you can safely remove those. Okay, so we're going to start disassembling the bottom end of the engine now. So that's going to consist of the pistons and connecting rods are just connected as one unit. And then we can pull the crankshaft out after that. So honestly, like a really simple process. It's just time consuming because there's 8 of everything that you have to do. When you're taking a crankshaft out, these main caps here that hold the crankshaft in, they have to be marked because they have to go back on the exact same location they came off, or else the machining will be wrong. And if you start mix matching parts like that, you could cause some catastrophic damage in your engine. All right, to take out your pistons, you're gonna wanna start by putting that cylinder at bottom dead center. That way the connecting rod can go straight out of the cylinder without trying to dodge the pin on the crankshaft. All right, so to take off your rods, we're gonna just loosen up these bolts to the end there. And these are rod studs. These are not rod bolts. So the cap is very tight on there because the studs are pressed into the cap, or rather the cap is pressed onto the studs. And then just go ahead and lightly tap on those nuts. That's what you're looking for.
You can actually see it right here too. Since there's a little bit of space from the nut on the stud up, there's a little bit of room to knock it down without actually pushing the piston out. So you always want to keep the nut on the backside like that.
And then you go ahead and remove the nuts the rest of the way. Sometimes the bearing will actually get stuck on the journal. So you just want to pull that off, put it back in the bearing. Set that bearing aside away from all other bearings until you get this piston out. And then we're going to want to put that cap right back on the same rod that it came off of immediately so that they stay together as a unit. There's these little markings right here, these little dots. They go on the same side as the markings on the rod. These are stock crank rods, so yours should be exactly the same. If you have aftermarket ones, they always mark them just so that there's some kind of indicators so you know. Then you get your little protector tool. It goes on over the studs just to protect the main journal, or excuse me, the rod journals from getting damaged when you drive this piston out. My rings are completely destroyed. Yo, that ain't good. So that's not something you want to see when you pull your pistons out. My rings cracked in half.
The next thing you want to do is remove 6 of these little core plugs. A common misconception with these is that they're called freeze plugs because supposedly when the water inside of the block freezes, if it so happens to be, when the water expands, it will just push these freeze plugs out. But that's completely wrong. In most cases, the block is actually going to crack at the weakest point. It could be somewhere inside. It could be somewhere outside. It is possible. And if the block cracks, then your block is completely toast. What these are really for, they're called core plugs, and you'll remove those so that you can do a deep clean in the block. What the machine shop will do is put it in a hot tank, and it's going to flush out all the rust and composites and all the old minerals and things that got stuck in there from the water and all the other fluids that were put in your radiator. And then when you freshen out all that stuff in the block, it's just a way of like cleaning out the block. Basically, all you have to do to get these out is get a chisel and a hammer and just start chiseling away at one of the edges of it. It will start to rotate out. You can just get some pliers and just pull it out. And don't worry about bending these up or breaking them or putting holes in them because they have to be replaced once you pull them out. The reason why I'm not going to pull these out is because I replaced these last time I rebuilt this block and I already had the inside of the block clean. So unless the machine shop actually needs to put this thing in a hot tank, I'm just going to go ahead and leave those in because as you can tell, they're already new and I won't have to mess with any of those. The next thing you're going to have to do is get the block off of the engine stand because you have these oil galley plugs back here that need to be replaced and you can't get to them when it's on the stand. So take the block off and then you're going to get these plugs out. In some very rare cases, you won't actually have to remove these plugs. But I have to because I had a bearing spin, which means there's metal throughout the entire engine. So these definitely have to be removed on my engine so that all the metal can be cleaned out of those oil galleys. Now, when you're removing these, all you have to do is remove the 3 plugs from the back of the engine using an Allen. Once you have the 3 removed out of the back of the block, a good trick to get the ones out of the front of the block is to take 3 push rods. Just take some old ones from the engine disassembly, preferably ones that you're not going to be reusing, and then slide them down into those holes. They'll stack up on top of each other, and then if you just tilt the block to the side like this, you can give it a good hit with the hammer, and it'll just pop the plugs out of the front of the block. And then the last one you're going to remove is kind of a hidden one. It's going to be on the top of the block near the head. Make sure you pull that one out too. So a big cause of piston rings breaking like this would be from pre-detonation. Basically what that means is as the piston's coming up on the compression stroke, before it gets to the top, the spark plug fires or the pressure gets too hot from a lean mixture, meaning there's not enough gas in there, or something of that nature that's going to cause the fuel and air to explode before the piston gets to the top. So if you can imagine what that would do, it would want to force the piston backwards. But because there's so much pressure and because there's so much torque on the crankshaft, it's going to come up anyway, and that pressure forcing up into an explosion cracks those rings. And these compression rings can actually be really brittle. Sometimes they'll even break when you're putting them on the piston. So you have to be super careful with these and definitely have your engine tuned correctly so that something like this doesn't happen. And so kind of trying to figure out a full diagnosis now that we have the whole engine taken apart. As you saw in the first video, the bearings from main cap number 1 were completely destroyed. The bearings are made out of copper, and above or on top of the copper, there's a silver coating. And if that coating wears away at all, then you know that bearing it's time to be replaced. But for the fact that this has grooves in it, that is no bueno. So basically what I think happened is for some reason there was an oil starvation issue at the bottom end. Maybe the oil pump was bad, maybe the oil was low, or maybe I was going around some turns and caused the oil pump to suck dry. It can also happen from keeping a high RPM for a long period of time. If you don't have a high volume oil pump to keep up with all that oil consumption going up, it's possible that in the middle of a turn at high RPM, the oil pump got sucked dry, and if that happens for even a second, that can cause major bearing damage as was happened here. And then once that main bearing in the front gets damaged and the clearance gets bigger and bigger on that bearing, it's going to cause the crankshaft to start wobbling like it was, and that wobbling is going to cause more damage, and then metal is going to start getting circulated through your engine, through all of your cam bearings, through the lifter valley, through everything. And then if that starts to happen, then metal starts ruining everything else. And then what I think happened was because of the oil starvation issue and the crankshaft wobbling, that crankshaft wobbling threw off the crankshaft position sensor from getting a proper reading, and that could have caused a high RPM misfire. Now, when something's misfiring at high RPM, it easily could have caused a cylinder pre-detonation, causing a ring to crack like that, causing complete engine catastrophe. There's really no way to know for sure exactly what happened to this engine, but another likely cause of broken piston rings is that the gap closes, meaning that the clearance in the ring end gap was too small, and then the engine either heated up too much, or maybe the ring end gap was the right size, but the engine overheated, causing that gap to close, because when metal heats up, it expands, and if that gap closes all the way, then it's going to cause this piston ring to force outward, and it's going to cause it to crack. One way that you can test it and to look at your piston rings to see if that was the cause is find the flat edge on your piston ring. One side's going to be machined flat, and the other side's going to be obviously broken. So if you look at that flat edge, you can see a little spot on the corner that is shiny. If you can see a little shiny spot, it's likely that your piston ring butted up next to each other on that gap, and that could have been what caused my engine to break too. There's really no way of knowing exactly what happened here, because it could have happened the first time I started up the engine. It could have happened when it overheated one day. It could have happened while I was racing it. There's really no way of saying.